Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see such a full house here tonight and also online. My name is Jed Kaplan, and I am the Canada Research Chair in Global System Modeling here at the Faculty of Science at the University of Calgary, and I will be your host for this evening's presentations. We're really glad to have all of you with us here for EARTHx, which is generously sponsored by the Gallagher family. We're grateful for the Gallagher's ongoing support that enables us to bring these amazing guest speakers from all over the world to come and tell their stories and discuss insightful topics with you. On behalf of all of us, thank you to the Gallaghers. We have two wonderful speakers here tonight discussing two sides of the same coin on extinction. The series of lectures that we are part of tonight is called EARTHx, and for those of you who've been to more than one session, you know that we focus on all kinds of topics that shape the Earth. From its geology to its history to the vast reaches of outer space, all of them influence the planet and its future. And thinking about Earth should also give us a sense of place, the place that we gather in today. We live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6, and even before the first peoples lived in this landscape, there were other animals living here, including dinosaurs that we're going to learn about tonight. Here at UCalgary, we are proud to be home to the nation's largest department of Earth, Energy, and Environment. We offer the broadest range of courses on geology and geophysics in Canada. And those who teach those courses know that a few things are more fascinating to students and the general public than extinctions. There's a sense of danger and awe about extinctions that reminds us of the tremendous power of our planet and the stars beyond. And while it's evocative to think about great mass extinctions of the past, the sad truth is that extinctions are continuing today at an unprecedented rate. Many species have gone extinct within the lifetimes of every single person in this room. But there's still a lot to be hopeful and optimistic about. One of the best ways to learn about what could happen in the future and how to avoid the worst potential consequences of global environmental change is to study the past. This helps us understand what it can teach about our world, where we may be headed, and how we may be able to change our future. We are fortunate to have two amazing speakers with us today. Riley Black is the award-winning author of The Last Days of Dinosaurs, When the Earth Was Green, and several other books. A frequent contributor to National Geographic, Smithsonian, Slate, and other publications, Riley has also enthused over the latest fossil discoveries on NOVA, Science Friday, the CBC, and more, and she has acted as a science consultant for the Jurassic World franchise. So she's got serious cred. When not writing or talking about fossils, Riley regularly joins museum field crews each summer to help uncover new prehistoric clues about life's deep history. Tonight with us, we also have Chris Jackson. Professor Jackson is Technical Director at the engineering consultancy WSP and visiting Professor of Basin Analysis at Imperial College London. Chris is interested in understanding how we can use the Earth's subsurface to safely store hazardous waste, that is, geostorage, and to develop low-carbon energy resources, or geoenergy. While not studying the underground, Chris gives geoscience lectures to the public and in schools, having appeared on several earth science-focused television productions and podcasts, which you're going to get a taste of later tonight. Today, Riley's going to take the stage first, and then I'm going to come back on and briefly introduce Chris's talk, and after that, we'll have a Q&A session. So please hold your questions for the end, where both of our speakers will come back up on stage. For those of you watching remotely, we'll have a number displayed on screen where you can text your questions to as well. So without further ado, I'd like you to travel back in time with award-winning science writer Riley Black to the last moments of the dinosaurs.
So I don't know if you all have heard, I do have some bad news about dinosaurs. I'm glad that you're sitting down. They didn't make it, mostly. I have been enjoying hearing the magpies all around campus today. They're friends back from Salt Lake City, where I'm from, and hearing their little annoying little calls, it just brings joy to my heart. But we don't really have the kind of dinosaurs, around now that we used to think of, or that we think of. Sorry, just getting the computer to do what I want it to do. There she is. There we go. We don't have murder birds like this anymore. 40-foot long, 9-ton chomp monsters that could take, about 100 pounds of flesh, toss it 10 feet in the air, catch it, and eat it. And these are the animals that we think of when we say the word dinosaur. And for so long, it's been a mystery as to why did they disappear? Why are we here and they are not? It seems kind of strange to become so fixated on these fantastic reptiles. Out of all the fossil creatures that have ever existed, it's the dinosaurs that we feel most personally about. Now, when the name dinosaur was coined in 1842, there wasn't really a question as to what had happened to them. It was, they appeared as part of life's progress. They disappeared as mammals came on the scene. If you were to ask a paleontologist about 100 years ago, why are there no more dinosaurs? Why there's nothing like Stegosaurus or Tyrannosaurus around anymore? And they tell you, they put too much of their vital energies into getting too big or too strange. There had to be, their own fault, basically, for evolving in such a strange way and going extinct. But during my lifetime, we finally realized what happened to these magnificent animals, and not just them, but to the entire planet. Because when we talk about the last days of the dinosaurs, it's really a euphemism for the world's 5th mass extinction, an event that is entirely unprecedented in Earth's history, and I very much hope remains that way. But something that even amongst other life's catastrophes stands out as something truly unusual. About 75% of species that we know about that were present at the end of the Cretaceous about 66 million years ago vanished virtually overnight. And I know we say that a lot in geology. We kind of are very guilty of compressing time a little bit too much. It's a million years, give or take. But in this case, this was a matter of about 3 to 4 years that this mass extinction played out over. There was not only a mass extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, there are mass extinctions of mammals, of lizards and snakes, of insects, of plants, mass extinctions in the oceans. What could have possibly changed the world so radically to fundamentally alter it and also allow our own existence? Because this story, we so fixate on what we've lost, but it's also a story of resilience, of the world as we know it, and why we are here today. That as much as I would love to see a critter like this in life, it would be impossible for us, just given the way evolution and deep time work, for us to exist at the same time. So we're always going to miss our dinosaurs, but we also owe them a bit of a debt. So far as we know, what actually happened? We've all heard about the asteroid. I think we don't have to, get into the debate over that so much anymore. The first paper, the Alvarez hypothesis, came out in 1980 in Science, incredibly controversial at the time, and now we know that this is the story. The case has been fundamentally built that this is what the extinction trigger was. It was not volcanic activity. Volcanoes actually helped, as I'll talk about, hopefully a little bit later in this talk. It was the strike of a 6-mile wide asteroid in what's now the Yucatan Peninsula. And what this space rock was basically a bit of debris left over from the formation of our solar system. It's recently been identified as a carbonaceous chondrite, an iron-rich bit of space rock, just a bit of debris that was more or less left over, somehow got caught in a gravitational pull and was basically influenced by Jupiter's gravitation, that between Jupiter and the sun, and slingshot toward our planet. This is the most devastating skill shot there has ever been. If you play pinball and you've gotten that 1 in a million shot, this is basically the geological equivalent, and a reminder that Earth's geology is also universal geology, that we are connected to a much broader geological story than what's just on our planet by itself. I could go into some of the numbers of how fast it was moving, the sort of the equivalent of TNT or atomic weapons that this impact affected for our planet. But it's like children's numbers. The words that we have for this, there's no way for us to entirely comprehend this. But if you just imagine for a moment this 6-mile wide chunk of rock hitting the Earth at a low angle, near the ancient coast, so fast that what was alive on the planet at the time probably didn't even see it. I love the evocative images of that streak going across the sky, but there was no moment of recognition amongst T-Rex or any other dinosaur going, it was moving so quickly that there was just something was fundamentally wrong. And it was so powerful that we're still finding the devastation that this impact caused. There's evidence of tsunamis in the Pacific. Basically, halfway around the world, there's evidence of seismic activity and tsunamis caused by this impact. So locally, incredibly devastating. How could it not be? But we've also had other major impacts during Earth's geologic history. Around 50 million years ago or so, there was an impact that left a crater that's about as large, if not larger, than Chicxulub, but is not, so far as we can tell, tied to a major global mass extinction. This really was, in every possible sense, the worst case scenario for something like this to happen. There was no way to evolve in advance in order to persist through this. There was no way to come up with a new adaptation. Everything was changing so quickly as a result. This was really something that life on Earth could not have possibly anticipated or evolved to address. Basically, what creatures carried with them and their ecological and evolutionary legacy would have to see them through. Recent research by Melanie During colleagues has identified that the impact happened in the northern hemisphere spring. It might have been around the time that many non-avian dinosaurs were building nests that a lot of creatures were courting. And in that first 24 hours, it's not possible, I think, to overestimate just how devastating the effects of this impact was. And we're dealing with both short-term and long-term effects. I'll mention the long-term ones first, because we're going to come back around to the impact winter. Because when I was a kid growing up watching dinosaur documentaries, that was always the image. It was always the image of sort of a very emaciated T-Rex kind of wandering through ash and then collapsing somewhere. And the non-avian dinosaurs probably didn't even live that long to get to that point. Because in that first 24 hours, you have this incredibly massive rock, strikes the Earth, part of it becomes pulverized, pulverizes what we call the target rock, the rock that it hit. And the rock that it hit was already fossiliferous. And this is really worth bearing in mind. It's one of the things that just amazes me constantly. We think about the fossil record as kind of a monolith, right? But the fact is, by 66 million years ago, by the end of the Cretaceous, there already was a fossil record of non-avian dinosaurs and other creatures. So, organisms that had lived millions of years before were already fossilized, folded into the rock. So the target rock that this asteroid struck used to be ancient reefs, basically formed these limestones full of sulfur. And we know from our own human activities that when we aerosolize some of these sulfur compounds, they get really good at reflecting sunlight back out towards space. And that would contribute to the impact winter. But there was something much more dire and something much more immediate that happened. And that's, you have all this basically glass created by the impact, shock quartz, debris, all this pulverized rock, small little bits that get sent back up into the atmosphere and start to come down in different locations all over the planet. This is the initial recognition of this impact, finding the glass spherules and all this impact debris at sites all over the planet, at the same time. It was the first evidence that we had. And if you've ever, watched a sci-fi movie and you've seen, a shuttle or a spacecraft kind of re-entering the atmosphere and the nose starts to heat up from the friction as it starts to heat the air, imagine that happen not just to large pieces of rock, but to all these little pieces that were just big enough to create this incredible friction, creating heat. And that heat created what we know as an infrared pulse. It raised the global air temperature to about 260 degrees centigrade. Basically, what we broil a chicken at. And when you think about, what's living on the planet at the time, what they can do in response to this, there's no way for an animal like Triceratops, like the big sauropod Alamosaurus, like T-Rex, to escape from this. It's so incredibly hot that dry forest layer spontaneously catches on fire. We have evidence of basically almost global forest fires from this time. Some geologists have hypothesized that almost any vegetative matter that existed on the surface might have been burnt in one way or another in those first 24 hours. And it's important to remember that it's not just the non-avian dinosaurs that go out during this time. There are whole other entire groups of organisms that disappear, even if we're just thinking of a sort of our charismatic megafauna that's alive during the time. You have the pterosaurs, things like Quetzalcoatlus, basically a flying animal that's about as big as a giraffe that could fly between continents. And this animal and all of its relatives disappear. In the seas, we have mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, lots of other marine reptiles. They also entirely disappear. Even something as simple, one of my favorite things to mention, redisted clams. Clams are about as large as a toilet seat. The other things grow upon them and they form reefs. Reef-building organisms that set up these whole other ecologies also entirely vanish. So it's not just the disappearance of individual species. This rocks entire ecosystems down to their very core. There's a paper that came out just a couple of years ago about coccolithophores, basically algae, these little disc-shaped algal organisms that form together in spheres. All the photosynthesizing ones during the impact winter following that first 24 hours of heat, they all die out. They almost entirely disappear. The only ones that are left are the mixotrophs, that these are organisms that they could feed on detritus as well as photosynthesize. And if they had not had that ability, the oceans would have gone back to basically a single-celled state. It would have been like hitting the restart button on evolutionary history and sending us back to the Precambrian in terms of ocean ecosystems. So this was just, it's impossible to overstate how devastating this was for the planet. And those are some of the initial effects. When we get to the impact winter, when we get to all this soot, dust, debris, all these sulfur-based compounds that are sending sunlight back out into space, photosynthesis is dramatically curtailed, and we also get acid rain. This is one of the reasons that we don't have a lot of great fossils from this time period. Research on these little, basically freshwater crustaceans has shown that their shells are being eaten away by some of the acidification of all these sulfur-based compounds coming back down in the rainwater. So the fossil record itself is practically a victim of this mass extinction. And this goes on for about 3 years. In fact, there's a study that came out just this year. Some of you at museums or zoos have probably seen leafcutter ants or know about ants that have agriculture, ants that intentionally cultivate fungus that they can use to feed on their nests. Based upon genetic research and basically when things diverged, looking both at the fungus and the ants, this relationship seems to have evolved directly in the wake of this impact. When everything is dead, there's nothing to eat but decaying matter, ants began cultivating fungus in order to survive. So there are things all around us even now that tie directly back to this moment. So given all this horror and devastation, if you cannot escape the heat, what do you do? We say 75%, this massive number of living things, so much biodiversity lost. And yet it's worth remembering that there's that 25% that does make it through. we're here. Many organisms that we see around us today are directly tied to this event. So how did they do it? How do you survive something that you cannot possibly prepare for? Well, as hot as it got on the surface in those first 24 hours, soil is actually a really great insulator. If you get about, I don't know, fraction of a meter below the surface, not very far at all, in burrows. We know this from modern day forest fires, that you're basically insulated from the heat. So if you're small enough to get underground, if you're able to get into your own burrow, borrow it from somebody else, find some kind of shelter, you would have been sheltered from that initial heat. Same thing with creatures living in the water. We find that many freshwater organisms make it through and many terrestrial organisms do not. So if you need some kind of buffer against that heat initially to make it through, and that's basically the first test, making it through that first day. After that, it becomes a matter of finding food. And if we look at the comparison between what goes extinct and what survived, it kind of gives us a bit of a clue. So at the very end of the Cretaceous, you have not only beaked birds, but you have toothed birds, and you have basically small raptor dinosaurs, all very similar. They're all feathery dinosaurs living at small size. Ostensibly, all could have survived that initial heat pulse and into the impact winter, and yet it's only the beaked birds that make it. It's kind of a wonder that we don't have little velociraptor things running around like wild turkeys, like, when we go outside. What made the difference? Well, toothed birds and the raptor-like dinosaurs, they were carnivorous. They ate insects, small lizards, things like that, things that would have been very hard to find during these impact winter years, when ecosystems were near collapse. Beaked birds, however, they had long evolved the ability to basically break down seeds, nuts, hard food tissues. They have gizzards, they have gastroliths. They're able to subsist on things that other things can't possibly eat. So the fact that they had already evolved this alternate evolutionary route, basically this diversification that happened during the Cretaceous, they won that evolutionary lottery and were able to find enough to survive and to make it through. And there are some organisms that just do really well in chaotic environments. We see this today in terms of ferns. If you have massive volcanic eruption or ecosystem disturbance, ferns and their relatives are amongst the first organisms to sort of pop back up again, sort of the regreening of the earth. And we see this in the fossil record about 100,000 years after the impact. We see fern spores everywhere. The fern spike, it's known as, by paleobotanists. And it's the beginnings of life starting to come back. And that's a very long time after impact, 100,000 years. Certainly far longer than we can imagine based upon our own human time scale. And yet that seems incredibly rapid, that you had this incredibly catastrophic event. And within 100,000 years afterwards, we're starting to see the regreening of the planet. Which isn't to say that everything is, just peachy for everybody, or that survival is assured. Extinction is not just a matter of the last member of a species dying out. We have all these ecological concepts around, when a species might functionally become extinct. For example, ammonites. The coil-shelled ammonites, there's a great old display downstairs showing some of them. They were thought to go out right at the extinction boundary. Turns out that they survived. They made it about 100,000 years after impact, and then they go extinct. We're still not entirely sure why. The best hypothesis so far is that they ate plankton, and they also had very, very small offspring. So in very disturbed ocean habitats, they might have basically cannibalized themselves to death by accident because there was nothing else to eat yet. They had a natural history and a lifestyle that made them more vulnerable. So even amongst the survivors, things are still a little bit tricky. But life is still hanging on. It's coming back, and we can trace this as much through genetics as looking at the fossil occurrences of creatures. About 100,000 years ago, this is a small fossil mammal about the size of a house cat or a small small dog. And it was living in these forests that are beginning to regrow, that are starting to come back. And when we look at the genetic record of what mammals were doing around this time, they had multiple copies of genes coding for an enzyme called chitinase. So basically they're eating a ton of bugs that, even though there's a mass extinction of insects, the surviving insect species are beginning to reopen the niches that were present before. They're starting to do the same things and proliferate. So from the ground up, basically literally, you have the surviving plants, mostly angiosperms or flowering plants, many of the plants we see around us today, starting to reseed and come back, allowing for the evolution of insects, allowing for the surviving mammals to start to open new niches, evolve alongside one another, until you get to a point about 1 million years after impact, and you get German Shepherd-sized mammals. This is a Masonechid called Eoconodon, found in Western North America. And it's one of the first carnivorous mammals that we see afterwards, living in these forests that were never seen before. I know this is gonna shock you, but Jurassic Park lied about the kind of habitats that dinosaurs might prefer. When you think about, where would a dinosaur live, and we think of, Fantasia or Jurassic Park and these sweltering, thick rainforests, dinosaurs would have absolutely hated them, and they actually kept woodlands open. When you think of these multi-ton animals walking around, trampling down vegetation, eating that vegetation, knocking over trees, it would have created a much different environment than what we expect, but without big animals around anymore. Everything's starting from small size and slowly becoming larger. You get forests that grow thick. And when you have forests that grow thick, they start to do different things. You start to get forest canopies at different levels. And within those levels, there's more opportunities for the surviving mammals. If you're having a hard time finding food over here, maybe you go up the tree, maybe you start burrowing into the ground. There's basically more ecological space, more niche space to be opened up in these new forests that couldn't have possibly existed before that underwrite, basically this burst that we see at what we call the age of mammals that involves our very own ancestors. And that's what makes this partially such a personal story, in that we know our ancestors were alive during this time because we all belong to the same evolutionary thread that's been going on for so long. But it's even more specific than that. The first primates that we know about date to about the same age as T-Rex and Triceratops prior to the impact. They're also present afterwards, and they look like this. This is the kaiju-sized version of this animal. In real life, it would have been able to curl up comfortably in the palm of my hand. Its name is Purgatorius, and so far as we know, it was a little critter that scrambled around the trees, eating insects, and it represents what the earliest primates were like. So close to the origin of our own group did they almost get snuffed out, and yet they made it through. And they arrived in this world at a moment where forests were coming together to give them the space to start to thrive, to start to diversify, and set the foundation for the world as we know it. So even though there was this terrible event, fundamentally changed the planet, got rid of non-avian dinosaurs that had been around for over 150 million years at that point. The remaining life, within about 1 million years, created something new and something vibrant. And when I went about writing this book, and why tell this story? Why tell this now? I could talk about the scientific reasons why, that we know more about the KPG mass extinction than we ever did before. In the past 10 years, we've learned amazing things about the timeline, not only extinction and recovery. There's still a ton of work to do in terms of understanding this as a global event. Most of what we know comes from Western North America, but there is a lot of new information to talk about. But books about this have been written before. Articles about this have been written before. For me, it really is personal. I'm gonna put this out specifically. Any of you who are here tonight or watching online who are queer, especially transgender, we are living through a time right now that feels like years of darkness, that the pressure is incredible. It's difficult to see what's on the other side of it. And yet, this is where I find my hope, in the small creatures that we're able to burrow underground, that were able to find resources that were there in the soil and persist, that were basically able to make it through because that darkness ended. And what we're facing now is going to end for us. And that is my message to anybody out there tonight who is struggling and who's looking for a beacon of hope. Think of these creatures. Think of what we have, already here. Basically, the seeds that our queer elders have put into the soil for us are going to help us survive. There is going to be an end of this, just like there was an end to the KPG disaster. And I look forward to seeing all of you in the Paleocene. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Riley. That was wonderful. So much to think about, but I want to keep to time. And so I'd like to introduce our second speaker for this evening, Dr. Chris Jackson. And as a reminder, we will have a Q&A session after both speakers. As we know, Earth's climate has always varied greatly, and there were times in the past when ice sheets could be found almost everywhere. The Earth was like a giant snowball, to times when water at the equator was as warm as a bath. Water near the poles was as warm as a bath. Occurring before humans inhabited the Earth, these often dramatic and rapid changes in climate were driven by a range of natural processes, controlling the habitability of our planet and its associated biodiversity. I'm getting into what I'm kind of an expert in, but I won't give this talk. Chris Jackson will, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the geologic record of climate change and how those changes impacted life on Earth. And perhaps most importantly, we'll look at how this can help us better understand our future. So please welcome Professor Chris Jackson.
Thank you. Okay, let me just... Oh, right, brilliant. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak. Climate change is on everybody's lips. US just re-left the Paris Climate Accord, wildfires, Western US, warmest year ever recorded last year. So climate change is everywhere, and we're continuously talking about it. And many of you will have seen these things, these so-called warming stripes, which document post-industrial warming of the planet. This is over about 167 years, this record I'm showing here. But for a geologist, 167 years is yesterday, of course, as Riley rightly pointed out. A geologist looks much further back in time, but critically what geology can do for us, and paleobotany and also paleontology, is it can give us a context in which to understand what we're living through now on this planet. It's recorded in the rocks and the sediments and all of the things that we find around us. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is the geological record of climate change. Over short time periods, we're used to these variations in temperature, seasonal variations. In this case, the extent of sea ice at the North and South Pole, you can see expanding and contracting in response to the amount of solar radiation, so the attitude of the planet with regards to the sun, and therefore the amount of solar radiation reaching different parts of the planet. So these are seasonal changes. These are speaking something more to what we would think of as weather rather than climate. If we think a bit of a longer time period, stepping back out again then to this kind of post-industrial period, in this case, data being shown from 1880, you can see over that last 140 years or so, there is this warming. And these data that are animated on here are from a number of different scientific institutions, these wiggles. And you can see that overall there's warming, but over shorter time periods, over seasons, but also over periods longer than that, there is an up and down, but overall the transit is upwards. This warming is obviously expressed physically on Earth in a number of different ways. The heat content of the oceans, the sea level itself, the extent of sea ice, mountain glacier extents as well. So we can see that fingerprint of climate warming all around us. So critically, these data that have been shown here are observational data. They're effectively somebody going with a thermometer outside every day and recording the temperature. But what happens if we want to go back further? Okay, so I've given us a bit of context from maybe last year with this graph, but what happens if I want to contextualize these graphs here? Well, then we have to think a bit longer, don't we? We have to go back a bit further. So we can think, well, okay, we have this observational data, which get us back to, just kind of the Industrial Revolution. But if I want to go back maybe, let's say, tens, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe a couple of million years, we can appeal to these sorts of data. We can look at gas bubbles trapped within ice. So we can analyze the geochemistry, the chemical composition of that ice, and use it as what we call a climate proxy. We can also use tree rings, the science of, I'm not going to ask anybody, does anybody clever in the audience want to tell me what it's called? Dendrochronology, yeah. So dendrochronology, the science of tree rings. So we have the records of climatic variations in tree rings. And together we can bring these, we can use these, and these sorts of data can take us back maybe a couple of million years maximum in the case of some of the deepest gas records from some of the deepest extracted ice cores. And they reveal this relationship between not only carbon dioxide and temperature going back in this case to about 800,000 years, but also a range of other so-called greenhouse gases as well. So they start to give us an idea of what some of the driving mechanisms are for these pre-industrial, pre-human variability in climate. But that's nothing. I want to go back further. I want to go deeper, and I think Riley used the term deep time. I love that concept. Deep time probably feels, 2 million probably feels deep time for most regular people. But we're going to go back even further now. Over the 4.5 billion years of Earth history, the climate has varied, and life on Earth has varied in response to that. And so what I'm going to show you now is a video of a scene from a lecture I gave a few years ago where I was tasked with telling 4.5 billion years worth of Earth history within 2.5 minutes, and the response of life on Earth. And we did it in a building called the Royal Institution, which is in central London. I was asked to walk for 100 meters around the building, and every step, which was about a meter, was 50 million years. So it's going to be a bit of a race. So I'll play the video, but just soak it in and see all of the different things that happened in Earth history during that period of time. So hopefully this will start.
So let's go back to the beginning. 4.5 billion years ago. It was literally hell on Earth. 200 degrees Celsius. That's 4 to 5 times hotter than the hottest place on Earth today. So how did we go from that to the place we now call home? Well, to show you, I need you to join me on a 100-meter-long journey around the Royal Institution where every step will be 50 million years. We better get a move on. Back then, there would have been no life-giving oxygen in the atmosphere. Instead, it would have been a poisonous soup of carbon dioxide, methane, and ammonia. This would have been a tough place to live. But then, about 3.8 billion years ago, the oceans formed and life appeared. Stromatolites were a trailblazer. These tiny microbial critters not only coped with the boiling temperatures and the toxic gases, but they were able to take carbon dioxide and turn it into life-giving oxygen. But for 2.25 billion years, until the end of this corridor, there was still hardly any oxygen in the atmosphere. Until the great oxygenation event, when some sun-worshipping bacteria learnt to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, producing food, with oxygen being the waste product. But the Earth's climate was restless. Sometimes it was snowball Earth. Other times, literally Club Tropicana. And then at other times, almost nothing during the so-called boring billion. But 1 billion years ago, things got really exciting. Sponges appeared. And single-celled organisms gave way to complex multicellular life that we now know as animals. Life finds a way. And then, 541 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion, an eruption of life inside and outside the oceans, animals, plants, flowers. But then, 252 million years ago, 75% of all species went extinct. Life is never easy. And out of the ashes, new and more complex life evolved. Dinosaurs came and went, the flightless ones anyway. Primates appeared, and then, 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged. And after our 100-metre-long journey around the Royal Institution, all of civilization can fit on the width of a single human hair.
So that took like 4.5 hours to film, and I'm still having therapy to get over the whole experience. But and I could end my talk there, right? But that was like, the Earth evolution in a nutshell, right? But I need to convince you that there is some geology underpinning some of these interpretations that have been made about all of those dramatic things. To tell you a bit more about the climate, or to put it in a more of a graphical form, this goes back about 500 million years, looking at the average global temperature. What I want you to take from this graph, there has been times in Earth history where the Earth has been really warm, and there's times when the Earth has been really cold, and in fact, colder and warmer than it has been, presently. We can see ourselves right at the end of this graph. So that's two things. The third thing is also there's been periods of rapid change. And Riley talked about this, but there's not just one at the end of the Cretaceous coming into the Paleogene. It's also other time periods. We can see there's these big swings. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at, I don't have time to talk through 500 million years of Earth history, you'd be pleased to hear. But I'm going to pick on a few different places here, and I love an emoji. So we're going to look at two periods to start with where the Earth was really, really hot, and look at what the geological evidence was that underpins that interpretation. And we're going to start off by going to the Cretaceous, about 100 million years ago, and look at these climate proxies in the geological record. And I'm going to start off here with a CT scan of a rock core that's been extracted from 1 kilometre beneath the seabed off of where is now Antarctica. So you can see a little map down there. We're on the West Antarctic shelf. And if I play this movie, we're going to zoom in. And these yellow dots here, these are layers of sediment. So these are sedimentary rocks that are preserved. And these were actually rocks deposited by ancient rivers in the Cretaceous, 100 million years old. But as we come down the rock core, what you actually see are the green colours will appear. And these are actually metre-length plant roots. And these are from conifer and fern-like trees that existed in Antarctica 100 million years ago. Critically, Antarctica at that time was roughly at the same position. Plate tectonics means that it wasn't that it used to be in a much warmer place and has drifted southwards. It was roughly at a fairly high latitude. So we have this evidence of these temperate lowland rainforests here at 82 degrees south. So let's hop now from the South Pole up to the North Pole. So this is inside the Arctic Circle. It's the Norwegian island of Svalbard. And here we see this beautiful beech leaf imprint on this non-marine rock. Oops. My computer was going to restart. And you see here these beech leaf in here. And again, this is a location where plate tectonics means that 55 million years ago, Svalbard was roughly at the same location, only then it wasn't this barren, kind of high latitude wilderness that we think of when we think of Antarctica and the Arctic. It was actually quite warm. So let's just focus again on this right-hand side. There's a magic number there, 55 million years ago. That was right at a point in time where we went from a period of Earth history known as the Paleocene into a period known as the Eocene. And that was associated with an event known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. If we go and look at rock core from across that boundary and we extract sediment and look at the chemistry of those sediments, we get some of these climatic records. And fortunately for you, this isn't a geochemistry lesson. So all I need you to believe me is that the oxygen O18 record, so that's the measurement of the oxygen isotope, so one of the chemical signatures within those rocks, you can see that there's a spike at 55 million years. It gets hotter in that record. And in the delta 13 carbon record there, we see there's a spike in there as well at 55 when it gets hotter as well. So we have two bits of evidence that not only did the planet get hotter from the delta 18 record, so the oceans which sample the atmosphere record that warming, but we also have this increase in carbon that was being generated. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum was a wild time. The estimates are that about 12,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide were released in only 50,000 years. the planet warmed to be between 5 and 8 degrees in only 20,000 years, and it took about 100,000 to 200,000 years for the planet to then cool again. Now, if the eagle-eyed amongst you will realize that on the delta 13 curve there, it's not the only period of time around that time when it got hot. There was a number of what are called hyperthermals in the Eocene. It was bloody hot. And I think you made the point about the ocean water being as hot as bathwater at the equator and even towards the poles, and that's indeed what has been sort of argued for here. Why did this happen? Because we weren't here. It wasn't an anthropogenic driver. To explain it, I'm going to take you to the North Atlantic here. So here's a map of the North Atlantic. My home is down there, the little island in the Northeast Atlantic. And at that time, the North Atlantic Ocean was opening. It hadn't fully formed, as Greenland was drifting away from Europe and North America was drifting away from West Greenland. And the red color there are lavas. There was huge amounts of magmatism, lots of lava being poured out onto the Earth's surface. Not only was lava being expelled onto the Earth's surface, but also there was lots of magma being intruded into carbon-rich sediments. And some of this sediment, the degassing, the contact between the magma and these wet, organic-rich rocks, drove off a large amount of carbon dioxide and methane. And this is one of the hypotheses for the main driving mechanism for the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. It was driven by plate tectonics. I knew you'd like this slide, Riley. The dinosaurs looking kind of, So we go to the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the KPG boundary here. And, Riley kind of has done my job for me here, which is great. This was a time when the Chicxulub impact crater hit the Yucatan Peninsula. There was this kind of post-impact winter. There was also this incredible heating of the planet as well. Riley also mentioned the fact that there was also the impact site in the Yucatan, where you can see the circle there, was a huge carbonate limestone platform. So in addition to sulfur being liberated into the atmosphere by this impact, there was a huge amount of carbon. Limestones are calcium, carbon, and oxygen, CaCO3. So there's large amounts of carbon being sent into the atmosphere. And that in itself could also drive the warming of the planet, this huge influx of greenhouse gas. But also, Riley mentioned that there was also acid rain. So when you mix carbon dioxide with atmospheric water, you also generate a weak acid called a carbonic acid. So that you actually get ocean acidification as well, which then plays into the destruction of these coccolithophore shells. So we've looked at the Cretaceous thermal maximum. We've looked here at the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. So we've looked at two kind of periods in Earth history where it was really, really warm. What about a period when it was really, really cold? For that, I'm going to take you back to a period of Earth history known as a cryogenian. So I'm going to go back to about 720 million years ago. We can hypothesize for a cold planet, and Jed used the term snowball Earth, we can hypothesize what would we expect to see. Present day, we have ice at the poles. So if the planet was really cold, we'd expect to see ice maybe down to the equator. But also, cold conditions are not simply found at the poles, they're also found at high altitude. So we have ice fields around the equator. So we need two things, right? We want ice, we want evidence of ice, not only at low latitude, but also at low altitude. To do that, I'm going to take you here to Namibia. And the location of Namibia, this time in Earth history, 720 million years ago, there was a giant supercontinent known as Rodinia. So you can see all the Earth's tectonic plates were all kind of around the equator. So Namibia at this time was around the equator. What you're looking at here, there's some beneath this geologist here, there's some limestones. These limestones were deposited in a shallow, warm tropical sea. And above this geologist's head is another layer. You can see those nicely layered rocks there at the top of the slide. They're also these limestones. But everything looks weird in the middle, right? There's some other type of rocks. These are rocks known as diamictites. These are rocks deposited by glaciers. And for those of you who know, these big white boulders here are called glacial drop stones. They're big boulders that are released when ice melts. So we have this really curious case. Namibia at the time was at the equator, doing what it should, having limestones deposited, but then suddenly there was a period of time at which glaciers formed at low altitude and low latitude. The hypothesis that's been put forward and been debated is this of snowball Earth, the Earth at a time which was completely encased in ice. Now, there's people argued about this. There's another beautiful term that's been put forward called slush ball Earth, which I think is much more fun. So some people have argued that the Earth wasn't completely encased in ice, but actually it was kind of, there were patches of ice and everything. So, and there's a series of mechanisms which led to this and then eventually brought Earth out of the snowball Earth. But I've just kind of presented to you briefly there the geological record for that rapid period of Earth history. So remember the graph where we went from hot to cold? That's one of the fingerprints of the hot to cold periods and back again. So to conclude, what do I want you to take from the last 18 minutes? Well, I want you to understand that the Earth's climate has changed over geological time. No geologist is going to come and argue that what we're living through here is unique in terms of the oscillation or how hot or cold it is. What we're talking about here is the driving mechanisms and the impacts on because we're selfish, on us, right? The evidence for that is contained in the geological record, and in that I'm not just talking about the rocks, I'm talking about the flora and the fauna which is encased in the rocks. So having that longer-term view of Earth history is a really powerful way in which to situate our present and our future. And we have a number of different tools which we can use to understand that. We can use things which take us back only a few thousand years, things take us back over to tens of millions of years. And we need to bring all of these bits of geological evidence together. And that's why it's powerful. It gives us that long-term context, but also the biodiversity bit. So that's exactly what Riley talked about in the case of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. But I think it's important for us to be really rooted in that, our own story, and therefore that of the longer-term climate change on Earth. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Wow, those were really great and so much food for thought. I especially appreciated a thread which I found in both your presentations, which is that it's perhaps not the absolute magnitude of environmental change that is most difficult for life on Earth to persist through, but it's that rate of change, right? It was that sudden shock that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. It was the abrupt transition at the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, and at other times in Earth history, including perhaps our current time in Earth history, that present unique challenges not only for humanity, but for all life on Earth. So something perhaps to think about. I'd now like to invite both of our speakers up on stage, so please come back up. And I know many of you have questions for Riley and Chris. If you are online, you are welcome to text your questions to our team at 403-708-5749. Actually, you can also text them while you're in the room if you feel like that too. If you're here in person, you're also welcome just to hold up your hand. We'll have a roving mic that we will bring to you, and we appreciate all of your questions. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible, but if we run out of time, then I'm very sorry, but we're going to do our best. And as we have two speakers, please address your question to Riley or Chris. And let's go ahead, yeah. So there's one in the very back. Oh yeah, okay. I'll leave it to the floor.
Hi, great. Is this on? Yeah, great talk. So this is for Chris. I'm just kind of curious. A lot of the big extinctions in the past have been driven by volcanism and emissions of carbon, and I'm kind of wondering, how do the big extinction carbon fluxes, like annual fluxes, compare to what we're doing today?
So I actually did look at this earlier on. So I think in that case there was 15,000 gigatons. So I think that, we're probably storing, the CCS schemes are looking at storing, I think, 10,000 tons, right? So that I think is the comparison I can think of, that you liberate a large amount of carbon very, very quickly, and then, anthropogenic sequestration of that is very, very slow. So I don't really know in terms of what our outputs are, to be honest. Yeah.
Like 200 to 300 over the last 100 years. So that's something to think about. Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Jackson, you showed those graphs where temperatures went up and down very quickly, but of course your graph had millions of years on it. How is the rate of temperature change we're seeing today compare with the rate in those past temperature changes?
So as I understand it, there's only 2 periods of Earth history where the rate of temperature change has been faster than it is today. One of them was at the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when we broke up the North Atlantic Ocean, or started to form the North Atlantic Ocean. The other one was the case of the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. That's the proviso to that is our ability to resolve the rate of climate change is limited by basically the rock record and the fossil record. And because we have biases in the fossil record, and because we have non-continuous exposures of rocks, and sometimes we have the wrong rocks in the right place, or the right rocks in the wrong place, we are still learning more and more about it. So, I think for me, it's useful to, I wouldn't consider myself a climate scientist, but I think it's always useful as a scientist in general to be open to incoming new data, because then we may find a time period in Earth history where the rate of climate change was more rapid.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? You want one over there?
Yeah, so those were both excellent talks, and I want to ramble a bit, but bear with me. So it's a question for both of you. And so ultimately what I'm curious about is, we all love science, and we're really excited about it. And you could argue that today is a really good point where we need science more than ever. And so I'm curious how, in a science communication kind of way, and both of you presented different ways of doing it, but sort of how do you maintain, inspire, and preserve curiosity in people currently and also into the future, so that they will want to know about these important aspects?
Right, yeah, I'll jump on it first. You mentioned the word curiosity, and I think that's key. I think that's something that it's its own skill to be cultivated. It might come more naturally when we're younger. It can be hard to maintain. It makes me think of, if any of you read John Steinbeck's Log from the Sea of Cortez, he has a moment in it when he's on this marine expedition to look at sort of the intertidal fauna, and they're going to all these spots down Baja California. And when they arrive in each town, they're saying, we are here to look at the intertidal fauna, and people are just like, I don't know what you're talking about. And when they switch, they just say, we're just curious what lives here. Have you seen anything interesting lately? People immediately say, oh yeah, I just saw something the other day, it's back at my house, I'll go get it. And I think just being honest about these things, about not getting too fussed about sort of the academia part of it, but connecting and saying I'm curious about this too. I want to speak to you in a way that you can understand, and I want to hear what you think about it as well, because science is done by people. One of my great inspirations in my career in general has been Stephen Jay Gould, his essays in particular, and how he emphasized that science is not just a machine that you input data and you get a conclusion, you put it on a shelf. It's constantly changing. And those human stories, I think, how we do science, why we ask the questions we do, and why we make the interpretations we do. I think the more that we can work those things into our science communication, the more we can connect with people. And the more people doing it, the better, because we all have different perspectives. We all have different backgrounds. And that's what I want to see more of.
My answer is less romantic than that. I'm British, so you just want the realism, right? I think curiosity and a love of the subject are really, really powerful mechanisms to get people involved and kind of getting people doing good work. I think we should also allow people to just simply do science as a job, not as a vocation. I think we just need good scientists to be doing good science I'm going to say it, in the service of society. I think there's a natural inquiry bit there, and I think there's a self-fulfillment. in both academic and non-academic spheres. But I also do think it's really powerful to basically say to people, you can make a really, really important contribution to society and you can get paid for it.
Yeah.
Right? And I think we all want that, right? Well, I'd like my scientists to love what they do, but I just, more importantly, I just want them to do it well.
Yeah. And that's the thing. We need it all. Throw the kitchen sink at it.
Thank you. Oh, great. Go ahead.
Fantastic. So first question here is for Riley. And that question to begin with is, what lessons do you think we can take from the KPG Extinction event in terms of how we survive dark or challenging periods?
I mean, the metaphorical sort of romantic version, as I mentioned at the end of the talk. It's something that I'm not sure that there is a prescriptive lesson from it. I think it's the temptation often as a science writer and science communicator to kind of do like the business secrets of the fossil record or whatever and kind of make it, applicable in a certain way. And where sometimes like, this is what happened. It is a historical record. This is the story of how life changed. I think it speaks to the importance of biodiversity, of variation and variety. This is the stuff that makes evolution go. When there is a mass extinction, or even just the background extinction rate that is constantly going. Every species eventually goes extinct, but many of them often spin off new species, and those species vary across populations. All of those, getting down to that level and appreciating how the more biodiversity we're able to foster, the more variation that we are able to sort of make a place for in this world, the more resilient our planet will be. And especially in a time of climate change that we're very much driving, I think that's more important than ever, is making spaces for living things to continue to interact, evolve, and vary. And that is how life is going to continue throughout as long as we exist and hopefully far beyond.
It's a beautiful answer. Thank you. Next question in from online here for Chris. What are the plausible views of what the environment will be like over the next few centuries if the trend does not materially change? And if you could do that without depressing us, that would be awesome.
All right. Am I the guy who just brings bad news? So if I understand the question correctly, there's a series of forecasts of continued warming. They range still, as I understand it, between I think 1.7 is the lowest number I've heard. That's kind of, we often say that's baked in. There's nothing we can do to avoid that. And I've seen numbers up to 4.3 degrees of warming over the next 100 years, 150 years or so. So they're the sorts of numbers we're talking about. And there's lots of people smarter than me who've modeled then the impacts of that warming on the heat content, or what we call the heat anomaly of the oceans, the thermal expansion of the oceans, how that then would drive sea level rise, how also the addition of fresh water from the ice, from land-based ice, how that would contribute to sea level rise as well. So that's maybe I'm sounding depressing again, but whatever. I've answered the question that there's a number, and the thing I find quite inspiring I hear from people is when if you miss 1.7 or 1.8, the next target should be 1.9. Right? So what we should be doing is everything to minimize the impacts and try to flatten the curves, because all the curves are kind of trending up. It's trying to, how do we minimize that? So one of that is about climate change adaptation, mitigation, and the other one is climate change adaptation. And adaptation is slightly more thorny as a concept.
If it's any consolation, a decade ago we were talking about 8 degrees by the end of the century, and so we're getting, because of technology, because of realization of what we're doing to the planet, 4.5 is now sort of an end of the century upper bound. So yes, I think that may help you feel better. There's a question over here.
Do you think it's quite possible we're past the point where we can control it, that it's become self-perpetuating?
Absolutely not.
No.
Fires, everything else?
No. So
could you take the microphone?
Sorry, I can repeat it. So the question was, have we gone past the point of no return where we can't do anything to essentially limit warming so that it doesn't lead to our species dying out? Is that a fair reporting of your question? Yeah, no, I think there's lots of things we can do. Even adaptation aside, there's lots of mitigation things we can do to limit the impact so that we... And again, going back to this human story, I mean, there's lots of terrible things going on in the world at the moment. But I really do fundamentally believe that we can come up with some incredibly good solutions, and I think we can solve very hard problems. And whether there's a will and there's a socioeconomic environment and financial environment in which to do that is a different thing. But I do think we can do it. So I absolutely don't think we're beyond the point of no return.
Yeah, what we do matters. It's hard because there's not, if you don't drive your car on a particular day and you walk or you do something that's a little bit better, there's no progress bar that'll show you like we reduced this by whatever percent of a degree, but everything that we choose, all the choices that we make, they do matter and they build up. So like, don't give in to climate doomerism, basically. That there's still many things that we can do. Limiting is better than, if that's what we got to hope for, then that's what we're going to do.
Yeah. I think we got a couple more questions online.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this one works well for both of you, perhaps from different perspectives, and that is, do you think the dinosaurs would have been able to or had the space to, perhaps keep evolving or maybe even be here today if the rock had missed us? In other words, would the other changes have perhaps wiped them out, or would that blow up over in the back be a real T-Rex right now?
Yeah. So I feel like this might be best answered just through like a little deep time moment. All right. So we all know T-Rex, right? We had Rex in the back 66 million years ago. Everybody, Stegosaurus, right? The plate-back, spike-tailed dinosaur, about 150 million years old. That's more than 80 million years between them. So you could fit the entire Cenozoic in that space with room to spare. They had been around for so long, adapted to so many different habitats and things like that. If the asteroid, not even missed, but hit in a different way, like, cratered in the ocean, hit different rock, was at a different speed, whatever, like, change the impact. And non-avian dinosaurs would likely still be here. But I love the fact that dinosaurs are still here. That, the last days of the dinosaurs, it's a little bit of a trick of a title. You can go outside and you can see and hear them. So we don't have to wonder too much. I would love to see the modern equivalent of, Anthropocene T-Rex, but at least we have our squawky little friends to wonder about these things.
It's a good subject for a sci-fi novel when you decide to go into writing.
So if you're interested in that sort of thing, there's a great book that was written in the late 1980s by Dougal Dixon called The New Dinosaurs that imagines exactly this. It's entirely speculative, but it's an incredibly fun book.
Cool. One over there? Okay, great.
For Riley, I just wanted to ask, do you think the extinctions between the Triassic and Jurassic and Cretaceous, like within the Mesozoic era, do you think that was also largely due to rapid climate change, or was it largely other factors, do you think?
So the KPG, like the weight of the evidence, indicates that was the asteroid impact. And I apologize they didn't elaborate on this further before. For a long time there's a debate, was it volcanic activity in the Deccan Traps in what's now India, or was it the impact? It turns out the Deccan Traps actually probably keep things alive, in that all the wonderful stuff that Chris was sharing about the effects of greenhouse gases, all that carbon dioxide, methane, everything else probably kept that impact winter a little bit warmer than it otherwise would have been. So the mass extinction would have been worse without that volcanic activity. But the end Triassic, beginning of the Jurassic mass extinction, that was driven by incredible sustained volcanic activity. And it's the difference of these slow grind mass extinctions that would take hundreds of thousands of years, if not 1 million years or more, to unfold versus 3 or 4 years. So the KPG is a bit of an anomaly compared to other mass extinctions, whereas many of the previous ones had very much to do with not only climate change, but acidification of the oceans, the local effects of just so much molten rock covering so much of the planet. But that mass extinction also gave us the age of dinosaurs. If we didn't have that mass extinction, it might have been the age of crocodiles based upon what was going on in the Triassic, which is an alternate history I would love to see written.
Let's go. One more comment on the question on the floor.
This one's for Riley. I was wondering if dinosaurs had continued to exist, how do you think they would have evolved, and how do you think we would have adapted to living near them, in modern day history?
So it's difficult to say how non-avian dinosaurs would have continued to evolve. We can kind of look at what continental drifts did, and sort of some certain things that maybe we'd be able to assume. But the fact is, the interactions between them and other living things would have shaped them in ways that we really cannot perceive. Really, anybody's guess is just about as good as anybody else's. But if that mass extinction had been canceled or altered in some way, we would probably not exist. We would not be here to live alongside them. It would have so fundamentally changed the world's ecosystems in creating a planet that was probably still hostile to small mammals running around through these prehistoric forests. That this is part of the tragedy of the dinosaurs, and that we miss them. I wish I could see them alive. I wish they were here. But if they were, that we wouldn't be. So this is grief. This is good emotional healing.
That is doomerism right there.
Yeah.
Do I have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah,
there's a few more on the floor. Do you have any more online?
Yeah, one more online.
Okay.
Yeah, so this question for both of you about science communications here. So you each had a different approach to your presentations. Riley was a bit more of a narrative focus, and Chris looking at some of the data there. How do you each decide how you want to tell a story like this in the most impactful way?
How do you... I think you need to simplify the story without offending your audience, and hopefully nobody in the audience, even if you're a kind of climate scientist, that you still manage to take something from aspects of the talk, right? So you need to try and pitch it between those people and also people who don't know so much about the science, right? So you want everybody to leave the room feeling kind of more knowledgeable than when they enter the room. And there's a number of different ways of doing that. I have videos, have things that move. That's how my brain works. Little text, less text the better. I want you to try and listen to me and my arms waving, and to just look at the images like Riley's talk as well. So I think that, but I guess to the question, I think I do that regardless of the audience. So whether I go into schools, or whether I'm talking to yourselves, or whether we're doing like a TV production, I always try and look at that kind of graphical, multimedia way of engaging with people. Because I think then, because we all learn differently, it allows everybody in the room to then access some aspect of your talk. And I think that's what you want. You don't just talk to one person.
Yeah. I have a bit of a cheat in that I literally wrote the book, so it was kind of living in my head. But I took the narrative approach in the book and in the talk, in that I wanted to think about these creatures as being alive. What would they experience? What did they go through? What was the view, more or less, on the ground during these events? We often talk about them in terms of who found what, in terms of fossilized bone and rock. And these are all wonderful, important things, the basis for these stories. But I know from the time that I was a little kid, the point of all of this, the point of all of this science, is to imagine what life was like, how it was different, and why it changed. And I want to bring a little bit of emphasis to that. They said a little bit of a different approach to what I'd done for many years. When I talked about the history of the science and talking about the skeletons that we see now and the fossil record, it went very well for my career as a science communicator, but it always felt like something was missing. I wasn't fully connecting. And when I said, here's the narrative, and I'm going to unpack how we got here for you, it was able to reach a different audience, kind of getting beyond the science savvy to people who otherwise might not have cared. And I think this diversity of approaches is really important to science communication.
Yeah, I would say as well, for geological record time, climate change, when you're talking about 4.5 billion years, you've already backed yourself into a corner. In terms of, I find it difficult. I don't know if I did it very well, but you're trying to do something which is almost impossible, to tell people about 4.5 billion years of Earth history through the rocks, fossils, and plants that lived on Earth. I mean, how do you do that in 40 minutes? So there is that, you have to pick and mix some of the highlights, and you do that, you have to try and get the things that resonate with the audience, so that hopefully you'll leave the room just knowing just one thing more than you came in the room with. Then I feel like I've done my job as a science communicator.
Well, you've done your job, because I definitely learned something from both of your talks today. So thank you so much. Can we thank our speakers one more time?
Thank you.
It was really great to have you with us today. And to the audience, our next EARTHx talk, I hope you enjoyed this one, will be in March. Registration details will be coming soon, so keep an eye out for that on the Faculty of Science website, or follow us on social media. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Cheers.
All the best. Yeah, thank you so much. That was great.